I really like that continuing education piece. So whether it's your dispatch license or perhaps a class, like I saw you took this Harvard Business School transformational leadership class, whether it's the CAM, whether it's whatever's out there that you can get your hands on to further that education, that's really what matters.
I agree, Lindsay. That's beautifully said.
Hello, and welcome to the Business Aviation Collective Podcast, sponsored by LD Aviation. Today, we get a chance to talk to Jennifer Pickerel. Jennifer has been in the aviation industry, for almost 20 years. The last 8 or so years, she's been with Aviation Personnel International. Prior to that, she was with Medair. And prior to that, she was with a cruise line. So we're going to hear a little bit about that cruise line. We also, we were talking a little bit prior to starting this, but Jennifer is living in Minnesota, and I'm originally from Minnesota. So we got a chance to kind of chat about that. But welcome, Jennifer, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored to be invited.
Oh, well, we appreciate you and your time and all the knowledge that you're going to bring. You have a really great background, and I love all of the pieces that you have on your LinkedIn about promoting, hard conversations and aviation in general. So I wanted to kind of go back, though. You didn't start off in aviation. If I'm not mistaken, your degree is not in aviation, and that wasn't maybe your path originally. So what was your original path, and how did you get to aviation?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It is always such a fun thing to hear people's kind of origin story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I feel like everybody in aviation, of course, has a different story. I went to college in Nebraska, the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and was an English major. And my plan was to become a poet and a professor.
Cool.
So I've been published a couple times, and that was always a real important part of who I was.
Cool.
When I graduated college, then I moved to Arizona, and I started working and supporting myself, and I lost sight of pursuing my master's degree, which of course I encourage my children that when they get to that age to do it right away. It's hard to go back. And then from there, my husband-to-be, at the time, he was a professional chef and had the opportunity to move to Florida. So we moved together, and I started working for, to your point, the cruise line. It was a luxury cruise line called Silver Sea Cruises. And that was my first exposure to kind of the VIP concept, knowing that these cruises were terribly expensive. And their service was second to none, and the expectations were incredibly high. And so that was my first exposure to kind of that type of service, the luxury brand, if you will, which, as we all know, translates well to business aviation.
It sure does.
Yes, it does. And so then we moved back to Arizona, actually. And because of my work in the travel industry, a friend of mine had referred me to Medair, which was, a business aviation company. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea that corporations had their own private aircraft fleet of aircraft. I had no idea high net worth individuals and the industry that surrounded all of that. So Medair was my foray into the industry. I worked my way through the ranks there at Medair, learning all the while, attending my first NBAA, where my eyes were as big as saucers. There was a helicopter on the floor. It was just incredible. And then actually I met Cheryl Barden at a maintenance conference. And we just started chatting and getting to know each other. And then she recruited me away a couple weeks later. And so, as you mentioned, I've been here about 8 years. Yeah. So, but I've loved all of my roles in business aviation. And I love what I do now. I really do.
That's awesome. So I want to kind of back up just a little bit. You went to a maintenance conference. Not a lot of females probably going to maintenance conferences. And that had to have been 8 or so years ago. So maybe even less at that point. What brought you to the maintenance conference?
Well, when I was still with Medair when I attended that maintenance conference and my first maintenance conference. And you and I both know, as we were even chatting earlier, there are a lot of unsung heroes in this industry. And in my perspective, tremendous respect for the pilots, but it is a very pilot-centric industry. So for us at Medair, the maintenance personnel, as well as honestly scheduling and flight ops, they were incredibly important. They were integral part of our work, right? Because they were the ones who, on the maintenance side, were buying and selling the kits that we sold, sending them for refurbishment. The scheduling and flight apps team, they were often in charge of if we were selling a security product or doing flight following for a medical situation, we were working with that community. So I felt really lucky that I had that exposure at MedAir to kind of all the different elements and some of the ones that are maybe less celebrated, right?
Yep, that's true. I think that's super important to be able to see all those different sections. When I worked with Cox for a little bit, we got to go and do job share kind of things. We got to go see what it was like to be in the maintenance department for a while and see what it was like to be part of the pilot. So yeah, that's really cool. And now you've continued, being very involved in the maintenance industry, and you're part of the NBAA maintenance committee, right?
I am. Yes. And I love that. I love that community. I tell you, there's just such a strong sense of community within that group. And one that I know, I just happen to know more than I know your community. I went to my first S&D conference 2 years ago. And I had the same kind of feeling that I did at NBAA my first time. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been here all this time and I didn't know about it, so that was wonderful. But yeah, the maintenance, they obviously, they're in control of the airworthiness of the aircraft.
Yes.
So, I mean, we wouldn't be seeing aircraft safely travel from one place to another without them. And it's not lost on me that all of the things that happen in the air are largely a part of what you all do, right? In the air and on the ground. So it's amazing to learn about each of those components and then how they intertwine.
Yeah, it really is. It's a whole team. It really is definitely multiple people in order to make that each and every trip go off correctly. And I think that we don't see a lot of that in our school, in our education, the way all of us are kind of coming through. Everybody knows, you can go to school to be a pilot, but people don't necessarily know that there's also plenty of schools on maintenance side, partly because there's a license, I guess, attached to that. But the scheduling and dispatch side is also, there's more and more classes that are popping up. You can get your dispatch license, so that helps. But yeah, it's not very well represented in our schools, fortunately.
I agree, unfortunately. And that's why I love when I was looking over your website and the Business Aviation Collective, and I saw that you're championing, these training programs. And I thought, oh, this is so brilliant, because there's just not a lot of opportunities for people to pursue further education in this line of work, right? So I learned just by looking at your website. I can't imagine that's definitely a resource I'll send people to now, right? Because oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're just probably like maintenance. I don't know as much about that section, but probably like maintenance, there just is not enough resources out there, and therefore not as many people even know it exists. And very few people are like, hey, I'm going to go to college, or I'm going to get finished with high school and I want to be a scheduler.
Right.
For me, it's a career. I love it. I don't want to do anything else. I don't feel like this is just an admin position, which is something we were kind of talking about earlier as well. Oftentimes this position is considered admin, when in reality, it's not just admin. It's a million things more.
It really is. And there's one parallel I want to draw for you and your listening community between the maintenance and would I say flight ops? Am I saying that correctly?
Sure.
Is that
yeah.
Okay? Because you correct me if I'm using that term incorrectly. But in the maintenance community and in the scheduling and dispatch community, there's not a clear path to leadership. So
Right. Yes.
a lot of the things that we talked about at the maintenance conference, which I think are very analogous to your community, is ways that you can raise your hand, ways that you can distinguish yourself, ways that you can actively and intentionally pursue more learnings within the department, outside of the department, make your ambitions known, ways that you can distinguish yourself so that you can rise within the department to whatever role you like. There are absolutely, Lindsay, I'm sure you're familiar, there are directors of aviation who came from the flight ops side.
I love it. Absolutely. Yes, we're starting to see more of them. Not a lot, but we're seeing more.
And I have to share that, and I mentioned this, I gave a presentation at the maintenance conference, and I talked to them about representation matters. And I know a lot of times that might have a trigger a tone in some people, but what I mean by that is when we go into a flight department, we being API, if we are hired to find a director of aviation, the first thing we will ask our clients is this a non-flying role? And if they say, no, we want this person to be a pilot, which is a lot of the former practice, right? That's still kind of lingering. And we'll challenge that, right? We'll kind of challenge, help us understand why. And I don't mean challenge in a confrontational way, but help us understand why, that's your need or that's a requirement. And what we're finding, so we really advocate to look beyond the pilot ranks, right? Because there are asset managers and maintenance. There are, all of the things that you do in the scheduling and dispatch community you know better than I, but, all of the things relative to the aircraft and the scheduling, but then also budgets, making sure you're tying all of that together. So our first goal is to orient our potential client to the fact that there are all kinds of professionals in your organization, and it's not just the pilots who are ready to lead in that capacity. So
that's great.
Yeah. So the next step then, in fact, I know that Cheryl was instrumental in getting one of those directors of aviation her role from the scheduling side. So at any rate, you have to make your ambitions known though. So once there becomes representation, so you have like Deb Brzezinski, you have Kelly Rittenhouse, right? In your community who have rose to the ranks of director of aviation. When we go to our clients and we kind of challenge this assumption or this thinking that they've been predicated on for so many years, they will say to us, well, tell us other companies who are doing this. Tell us other companies who are hiring beyond the pilot side. So we have a list. So I would encourage you in your community, you make sure you have that list handy. You know what I mean? And you make sure that you tap the Debs and the Kellys and for how do we do this? How do we replicate this? That would be, and I said the same thing to maintenance. You really need to make sure that you work together to identify some kind of a path, because in a flight department, there might be a progression-based list for an FO to become a captain, but there's no list for a scheduler to become a dispatcher or dispatcher to become a manager right? So it's not fair, but those are the cards that have been dealt right now. And so you really need to take it upon yourselves, right? To really share amongst your community how we rise to that.
I love that. And that's a really good suggestion. Go out and look at those other companies that are doing it. And I'm sure the Wendy's of the world, the Kellys, the Debs of the world, right? They're probably, if you want to do that, if you reach out to those, I would bet you hands down, they would love to talk to you about it and tell you how they made it or give you a suggestion. Now, I hope a million people don't bug Wendy and I guess not bug now, but I hope I say that.
Sorry, not sorry.
Yes.
I'll take the fall.
My goodness. But this is such a networking industry and people want to help. And that's great. Look at the path that other people have taken and get tips that way or get tips from them. Great idea. I do kind of want to see, so what are you doing on your day-to-day basis now? Because you've kind of changed roles in API over the years. You were doing client services for a while and now you're the VP. So what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I manage our team, which is an amazing, we're small but mighty. And I still am the lead on many of our leadership projects. So if a client comes to us for a chief pilot, a director of maintenance or above, then typically I would be assigned as the project manager, if you will. So I'm liaising with the client. Our process consists of us going out and visiting on site. So if LD Aviation, if you had your own airplane and you called and said, we need a new director of aviation, I would come spend the day on site and learn all about your culture. And I would meet one-on-one with your team members to ask them, independent of management's oversight, what do you love about working here? What would you change about working here? We really get inside the department to try and get a handle on all of those nuances. And then we bring that information back to the ranch, so to speak, and we work as a team and we comb through our database for candidates who have identified that type of role as their next ideal. So the great thing about API is that when you register with us, of course, there's no cost to register as a candidate. We ask you to write an autobiography. We get to know you really well, independent of any opportunities. So I would be talking with you, Lindsay, about what are your goals? What are your career aspirations? What do you like? What do you not like? What type of culture is exciting to you? What type of leadership do you look for? And so we get to know you in this really authentic way. And most of our registrants are passive job seekers. So our preference is that you're happy where you are and you come to us and tell us what your next ideal job would be like. And then we reach out to you if we find something that's a fit. So that's my primary responsibility. And then, our team is all very involved in NBAA and trying to give back, so we're all members of committees, as you heard. Mm-hmm. And so that's a real passion. And, I have been at the forefront, fortunate to be at the forefront of a lot of the DE&I conversations that we're having in this industry. We all know there's a crisis, a talent crisis.
There is.
And ever since the FAA, our numbers in aviation are so dismal when it comes to women and underrepresented groups, way below other STEM industries.
Mm-hmm.
So the FAA created that Women in Aviation Advisory Board to find out why don't women and people from other and underrepresented groups come to aviation. And after a 2-year study, they found it was culture. Culture was the biggest impediment to that. So I thought that was very interesting too. It's a great report if you're able to find it online.
Okay.
And in fact, I know that Amy Spowart, I hope I'm saying her name correctly, she is one of the members of that advisory committee. And I know for a fact she posted on her LinkedIn. But at any rate, since that discovery, if you will, we've really been championing with our DE&I group Endeavor to try to talk about culture, to talk about community, to talk about what it's like to come into a department as the only whatever that is. And it's interesting because I think you and I were talking about how, in general, people in business aviation are really willing to lend a hand to one another. Like if I were to call you and say, Lindsay, I'm having this struggle, I have no doubt you would say, what can I do for you? Right?
Yeah, right.
I've seen that, with my daughter, who I mentioned to you is getting her pilot license. She's been struggling terribly. And people in our community have said, I would love to talk with her. I've been so touched by it. Now, the interesting thing is that it doesn't always translate to the flight department atmosphere, right? You have some flight departments that are not as welcoming and are not maybe prepared to welcome somebody from an underrepresented group or a woman. And sometimes that's through no fault of their own if they haven't really been given any resources or they don't have anybody who's having those tough conversations with them. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the things that we champion with our group and to try to get a business aviation to get over that cultural hurdle, so that we have a better reputation out there in the big bad world,
I'm so glad that you guys are doing that. I've definitely been in cultures like that. I've been the only. I've also seen onlys come in and it didn't work out because the culture just wasn't welcoming. And that's really too bad because in those cases that I've remembered, they were just wonderful people and really could have added to the whole culture and department and company, but it didn't work out. Culture wasn't the right spot for them. So you have, obviously, through your time, you have seen all sorts of stuff. So you get a chance to probably see compensation lists, I would guess, and who's getting paid what. Do you have any information of the scheduler versus the dispatcher in the compensation realm? Because I think a lot of people in our industry are like, well, why do I get my dispatch license? What is it for? Is it going to actually help me? Do you see any bumps for dispatchers versus schedulers?
I do. I mean, in speaking for API, obviously, from my vantage point and our vantage point, like any other profession, the more accreditation you have, the more professional you are perceived to be. And the other thing, Lindsay, in fact, I just was earlier today talking to a candidate who said, I really have leadership aspirations. There's no place for me to really learn leadership skills in my flight department. What can I do? So we talked about the CAM certification for NBAA. And he said, well, I've heard mixed reviews. Some people say it's valuable. And I said, listen, it demonstrates a commitment to continued education. Right. And so that is always valued. And what's great is that's available to anybody and everybody. I mean, it doesn't matter what discipline you come from. But on the schedulers and dispatchers side, there is this distinction. I mean, for what I understand, you correct me if I'm wrong, when you get your dispatch license, you're literally going to ground school.
Yeah,
like a pilot,
you are.
right?
Mm-hmm. You are.
So, I mean, that in and of itself, it's interesting because in Part 91 aviation, you cannot practice as a maintenance professional unless you have an A&P, an airframe and power plant license.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But in your discipline, you can practice some things without, right? So whenever you have that duality, then naturally, if you have the accreditation, then it's going to rise you up higher, right?
Definitely.
Now, I'm not saying there's a huge differential, but I will say this. You and I were talking about this at the beginning of this call before we started recording. For an industry that falls into that kind of unsung hero category, that's my own terminology, you really have to be well-versed and articulate about demonstrating your value. And this is one of those things. So if you have your dispatch license, you should absolutely when you are interviewing, when you are receiving an offer, you should make sure that it's commensurate with what your value is and what your education is. Don't sell yourself short. I mean, like it or not, this is a discipline that you're going to really have to raise your voice up in confidence and know your worth, right? I mean, that's for women in general. And then in some communities, even more so, right? I mean, because like we were saying, you are the glue that holds it together, but people can't see glue. It dries invisibly.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
We're all behind the scenes, and that trip, when it goes off well, nobody says a thing. Not that we all need, good attaboys every time that something goes off well, but if it doesn't go off well, it certainly does come back to usually the scheduler dispatcher role, that flight ops role there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I really like that continuing education piece. So whether it's your dispatch license or perhaps a class, like I saw you took this Harvard Business School transformational leadership class, whether it's the CAM, whether it's whatever's out there that you can get your hands on to further that education, that's really what matters.
I agree, Lindsay. That's beautifully said. And, I know that NBAA just came out with a course that this community. And please, I want to make sure that the listeners realize I'm not saying that a dispatcher is valued more, or I don't want to give that impression, because just like, let's say, a college degree, there might be somebody who's been a scheduler for 20 years and they know everything and more that you can get in a dispatch license.
Sure.
So that's not to say that trumps everything. I just want to be careful to not offend. I appreciate you making that point, because it really is just about, how have I continued my education? How have I continued to try to further myself in whatever vein? And the other thing too, I said to this candidate earlier today was, committee work, volunteer work, that's a great way to kind of walk into the shallow end of leadership. If you start on a committee and then over time you volunteer to be, the vice chair, and then you make your way to the chair. As a recruiter, I've had people say to me, well, there's no opportunity for leadership in my department, but I went to the schedulers and dispatchers committee, and I'm on this and I do that. And that absolutely comes into play, and it's a great place to network. So, I mean, that's like a no-brainer, right? If your company will allow you that time to participate, even in a small way at first, that's kind of the way to dip your toe in the water.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah. Go out there. All the committees are always looking for help. And there's committees in a million different specific items. So maybe you want to plan events. If you like events, I'm sure the S&D committee could help get some help in planning an event. Or maybe I know I did some on the small operators, the domestic operators conference, and I really like the small operators. So there's a division for specifically small operators. So I got to find that. But yeah, there's opportunities in just about any specific field or idea that you want to go for.
Yeah. And I'd be remiss not to mention the regional groups too, right? So that's the other thing, S&D is fantastic, but then so here it's the Minnesota Business Aviation Association, and they have a scholarship committee and they have an events committee so there's lots of opportunities, right? And if there's something there locally for you, I would definitely encourage you to look into it. because a lot of that stuff you might be able to do in your own time if your company is, and I realize not everybody has access or has the opportunity to do that, but a lot of those functions are usually in the evening, like a happy hour or whatever. And so I'm sure that you could find a way to participate if that's your desire.
Definitely. Which that brings me to like two questions. I wanted to kind of talk about employee versus contractor, remote versus in office. But before I head that way, my entire team is remote. I'm remote. I've been remote for 10 years almost now, which personally, I love it. But I don't get a chance to see a lot of people. So going back to that, joining your regional group and joining a committee, that allows you to meet more people, which almost, I would say, 99% of the time opens up doors to something else. And you don't know what that something else is yet, but you'll know when you get there. And I think I lack that now from working at home. So those additional pieces to the community, joining other things in the community are very important. More important, I would argue, than before when I was going to the office and I was having those interactions with the entire flight department on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I got off on a tangent, but I really think with this remote world, you just have to do more with other people.
I really agree. And you and I, it's so funny, we have that in common. I was doing the math the other day and I've been remote for over a decade now. And our entire workforce at API is a dispersed workforce. And so we all talk about, where we really get our energy is when we get to go to conferences and we get to meet up with all the people that, we formed relationships with in the industry, friends, professionals, and everything in between. And so if you have that, to your point too, in the backyard at your regional, I couldn't agree more. I think that's a really good point, Lindsay. If you're remote, even more reason to kind of push yourself out of your comfort zone. It can be hard. It can be hard to show up, as the one I still get nervous, walking into a networking event if I'm by myself. And so, and the other plug I'll just make is, that LinkedIn can be a really great tool for networking as well. And I volunteer with a lot of college aviation programs just to try and get the word of business aviation out there. And I talk to them about how, I could put in Sam Smith at, let's say there's a particular company that you're interested in. So in this case, I'll say at Netflix, let's say, or you could put in pilot at Netflix or scheduler at Netflix, and it would pull up anybody on LinkedIn who's registered in that capacity. And then you can send them a private message and just say, I'm new to the industry, or, I see that you've been at Netflix, let's say for 5 years, would you be willing to have a conversation with me? And I often share that as a tip for people who are a little intimidated, like me, to do the in-person networking.
Sure.
It's a really nice way, a less threatening, if you will, way to get to know people, right? So I just wanted to mention that as well.
That's a great idea. I hadn't thought about that. And I've got 2 teenagers heading that way towards college at some point here, I think. And I'm going to pass that along to them, because I definitely have one that's like, I don't think she would really enjoy going out maybe at first and trying to just meet people straight in person. So that's a great tip. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And I'll just say one more quick thing on that. What's great about that too is, let's say you're entertaining a job offer from a company and you want to know, it can be hard to understand the cultural nuances of a company when you only get to interview once or twice before you're potentially offered a job. So you could put in anything at said company and look at those people and then ask if they're willing to have a conversation with you about their culture. Or just by looking at the people, you might be able to say, oh, wow, it's almost all former military. Or sure, wow, you could identify cultural similarities. So that I'm always cautious about people not doing their research before they take a job. So that is one of the pieces of research that I always really encourage, is to try to get to know as much about their culture as you can.
Very important. Very important. So what about, I'm kind of thinking, we work with a lot of smaller flight departments, right? And a lot of them don't have huge lists of people on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Any
tips on, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, I guess, but any tips on how to do that? Maybe when you can't find somebody that you might be able to talk to? Because we do replace, we come in sometimes and we'll help somebody out and take care of their scheduling because maybe their scheduler has left and they don't have a new person. I find it hard sometimes to get those smaller companies' culture figured out.
So that's when you probably have to cast a wider net the first time around. The good thing, like you and I were talking about, in the world, it's maybe 6 degrees of separation. In our aviation community, it's maybe three degrees of
Right.
separation.
Yeah.
So what I would probably do is reach out to somebody who I know maybe in the region, reach out to somebody that I think is fairly well connected. And I would say, do you know anybody who works here? Do you know of anybody who knows of somebody who works, and just kind of start asking that way.
It's a great idea.
And there's always a lot of, you have to take it with a grain of salt, but, if it's a small business, could you go to your small business operators committee and say, does anybody know anything about XYZ company? Or do you know somebody there? So that's when I think I would really dive into my network and figure out. And there again is the importance of building that network, right?
That's a great idea. And MBAA, I believe, still has that search engine. So you could put in the airport and maybe find other operators that you could reach out to that are on that same page.
Better idea, Lindsay. Yes, that's a great idea.
See, together we will come out come up with an awesome ideas.
I love it.
Oh my gosh. I had been interested to know, do you see change, or what do you see as far as employee versus contractor? I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, but employee versus contractor. Are companies tending towards one or the other?
Of course, depends on the size of the operation.
Okay.
I will tell you from a schedule and dispatch perspective, we've talked and I've referred to you, yes, definitely some smaller flight departments who don't know if they have enough work for a full-time. I'm sure that you're familiar with this kind of scenario. Don't know if they have enough work for a full-time scheduler. Don't know if they want to take on the headcount of a permanent employee, but they know, like this one particular flight department, in fact, it was because they were absent that function, all of those duties were falling to the pilots, which was actually making the job not at all competitive.
Sure.
That makes sense, right?
It sure does. Yep.
And candidates are asking us, well, what are the ancillary duties? And I say, well, they don't have a scheduler, so you have to X this, that, and the other. They're like, ugh. It's pilots are being paid top notch right now. So those things get really competitive in that matter. So anyway, my point is, I think more and more operators are realizing the importance of at minimum having a contract person. And, I find that if they're using contract personnel, it's likely because they don't know or they don't have the budget potentially for a full, full-time FTE. That's the way I see them used most often. And similarly on the pilot side, maybe they have a full roster, but, they use the contract pilots for absences and, things like that. So, and that's become even more popular now, right? And I think one thing that's interesting with this younger generation, this side hustle, I think that this whole notion, and I think there are more people moving into the contracting space, like realizing they can be their own boss. They can, you probably have some interesting insight into that, but we've definitely seen that in the pilot community, that, I could go make this amount of money, or I can be my own boss and make, so there's positive and negatives both, and some job sharing, we've seen some kind of creative things that way.
I think that's a cool new thing. Not new, I guess, but I think we're going to see some changes with job sharing coming up. And
I agree.
That's super exciting.
I think so too. And I look forward to, this younger generation has a very different understanding of the employer-employee relationship. And I think they're really going to push us to challenge a lot of the norms, that we've practiced over the years. And when we recently were hiring talent for API, we intentionally set out to find somebody of a younger generation, because we knew, for one thing, they have a wealth of information. When we hired Lisa Barrio, she's on the S&D committee and runs the education sessions. Anyway, we're incredibly proud of her. But, when we hired her, we said, we hope to learn as much from you as you do from us, and that really should be the mindset, right? Is I would really encourage people to be open-minded to what that generation has to say, because I think that they're just not willing to put up with a lot of stuff we kind of had to. So anyway, I'm kind of curious to see the impact they make. And I think it's going to be positive. I really do.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. I just remember just the change in remote. And of course, the pandemic changed a lot of that as well. But early in my career, there is no way anybody was doing remote. Like it was like butt in the chair. You had to be there. It is not as necessary. I mean, I know some people really want somebody to greet the mail person or perhaps greet passengers on the way out. And those are still valid requirements and everything, but certainly not on a, 8 to 5 time frame. So yeah, I like the changes that are coming in. And I really think you're right. We're going to see some more exciting, and I guess we'll call them strange to us, ideas and innovations in that section.
Right.
I'm excited to see how it goes. So I guess maybe we can incorporate some of those at LDA as well, because we want to harness that younger group as well.
Yeah. I really think they have so much to teach us, and it's the most diverse population ever.
Sure.
They are the most diverse. So I think that in and of itself is super interesting, right?
Yep.
So they have a different sense of community. They have a different, they have a lot of, and I know, it's very typical for people, for one generation to kind of condemn the generation that's following that, these kids are gonna, but that's the way it always is, right? So anyway, yes, I think that'd be great if you tapped into some of that talent and got their take on some of these things,
Yeah, for sure. Well, Jennifer, you have like a ton of experience and a lot of classes that you've gone to. Does that mean you like to read? Do you read books as well, or listen to podcasts? And the reason I'm asking, I'm looking for some suggestions maybe for our listeners of maybe a good book that you've read or a podcast that you've listened to lately.
So for this program that I just recently went through, which was an 18-month program, the one where I had instruction at INSEAD and Harvard, we had to read a ton. And I do have one good recommendation, but a lot of it was on gender equality, culture, the transformational leadership, things of that sort. But one book really stood out to me. So I've taken a little bit of a break from reading just because there was so much.
18 months.
Yeah. And truth be told, you could find me at any conference and I'll have a book of poetry in my briefcase. So that is always a standby for me. But there's a book called Forged in Crisis that's by Nancy. I want to say her last name is Kane, but it's Ohen, or it's a kind of a different spelling. But what she is a historical researcher, and she took its 5 segments, one about each segment about a different leader. So for instance, one is about Abraham Lincoln and a very tumultuous time in his career. So she takes a leader and zeroes in on a time of crisis. And she then talks about how that crisis helped form their leadership identity. And what I love so much about the book is that it's really interesting because she's just a great factual, if you like history at all, she just does a great job, and it's not like boring history,
Got it. Good.
Really interesting. But she talks about how leaders are not born, leaders are made. And that while I think a lot of leadership is instinctual, there's so much to be learned. And what I also love is all of these leaders in each of these segments, they're just racked with self-doubt and they're incredibly vulnerable. They don't know what to do. When the crisis hits, they're privately wringing their hands. And so it was just really nice to be able to say, okay, I'm not alone. Like even these remarkable people, there were times in their life where they didn't know which road to take. Mm-hmm. So I found that just very reassuring, and it makes you realize that good leadership is attainable. I mean, we can learn to do those things. We can learn to become leaders through crisis, if you will. So that way,
I think that's a wonderful statement. You can learn it. So maybe you don't feel like you are a leader or leader quality or anything like that right now, but you can learn it, and you just go through life and you gather more and more education. Like you said before, that's super great.
Yeah. And I will say this, if you're in a situation, if anybody listening to this is in a situation where maybe you aren't happiest at your job, or you're struggling with a leader who maybe isn't kind of an aspirational leader. When I look back on my career, I learned so much from those people too. Even if you're learning what not to do, right? Even if you're learning, that really is valuable information. And so that's when I've been in a tough spot in my career in that type of a situation, I've tried to turn my perspective, right? To, okay, this is a crummy situation, but let me learn what I can, even if it's what not to do or what type of impact, you know what I mean? So just a little hint, because we've all been there, right? It's tough coming to work if you don't enjoy work. So anyway, just throwing that out here.
Another great suggestion. That's awesome. Okay, I have two short questions here for you, and then we'll wrap it up. First one is, okay, you mentioned you were published earlier in the beginning. Did you publish poetry?
Yes, but in our collegiate journal, it wasn't like a bestseller by any means, but yes.
That's so cool, though.
Just way back when. So sometime in my future years, I would love to dabble in that again. That's still something I love to do because I love the creativity, that's something that, you said at the beginning of the program when you and I started chatting, if you can find a way to work those creative elements into your daily life or into your work life, and if not, then on the side. So that for me is something I still like to dabble in.
Nice. That's cool. I remember you saying that, and I was like, I want to ask her about that. So, and okay. So Jennifer, last question. It should be an easy one. If somebody wanted to reach out to you and maybe ask you a couple questions, how would they find you?
Yeah. So find me on LinkedIn. Fortunately, the last name Pickerel, Pickerel, is not very common. So Jennifer Pickerel, find me on LinkedIn, connect with me. I'd love to connect with you, and then send me a message and we can chat. I would welcome that.
Wonderful. That's so very generous of you, Jennifer, and generous with your time as well today. Thank you so much. And it was great hearing about all of your expertise and all your experience. And I'm sure you've inspired somebody along the way here. So,
well, I hope so. Right back at you, Lindsay. Such a pleasure to be here. What a fun experience. And I'm so impressed by all you've done. Yeah.
And we'll have lunch one of these days when I come up to Minnesota then.
Yes, we better. There's all kinds of fun places we can go. That's for sure.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, thanks again, Jennifer. And enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening. Please stay tuned for more episodes and check out our website for up-and-coming podcasts. This has been a production of the Business Aviation Collective, sponsored by LD Aviation.